In the river valleys of Washington state, in 1896, stood a Douglas-fir that is considered to be the tallest tree in recorded history. A 480-year-old living monument that was so tall it would dwarf the Statue of Liberty and the tallest redwood alive today by nearly 100 feet. Yet within just a matter of hours, this remarkable titan was erased from the planet. What you're about to hear is the chain of events that led to the destruction of the Nooksack Giant, and how its felling triggered a devastating pattern that led to the near-total loss of the ancient forests it once lived in. In 1891, 2 timber cruisers were exploring the Nooksack River Valley in Washington, and what they found was a treasure trove of untouched woodland, an acre of forest so dense, so untouched, that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Ancient trees rose from the valley like living skyscrapers, their massive trunks disappearing into a canopy hundreds of feet above. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer later described the grove as the forest primeval. They documented Douglas-fir trees measuring up to 14 feet in diameter and heights estimated at 350 to 400 feet, specimens pushing the known biological limits for life on this planet. But these men weren't documenting these trees for science or conservation. They were surveying timber resources for the booming Pacific Northwest lumber industry. They estimated that this single acre of living giants, built over centuries, contained an estimated 500,000 board feet of fir timber, along with another 500,000 feet of cedar. The result was wood so dense and perfect that it would become the most valuable timber anyone had ever seen. Unlike the fast-growing timber we see in managed forests today, these ancient trees developed incredible quality through centuries of growth that no modern plantation could match. And standing proudly amongst them was a single Douglas-fir that towered above everything else in the forest, a specimen so remarkable that it was simply known as the Nooksack Giant. At 480 years old, it began life before the printing press was invented, before the Renaissance, and before Europeans knew the Americas existed. And although the Nooksack Giant and the rest of the valley were a potential gold mine for timber companies, the technology of 1891 made it impossible to log such trees. Oxen and horses could only drag logs short distances before exhaustion, and the valley's rugged terrain made industrial harvest economically impossible. But this protection was about to disappear. The expansion of narrow-gauge logging railroads was quickly opening up previously inaccessible areas to industrial-scale logging. And now, the Nooksack Giant that had survived nearly 5 centuries of storms, fires, and natural threats was about to face the one thing it couldn't endure: human ambition. By 1896, narrow-gauge railroads had reached the Nooksack Valley. What once required impossible overland transport could now be loaded onto rail cars and transported directly to the nearby timber mills. Not only that, but steam-powered equipment could now handle logs of unprecedented size, and the crosscut saw technology allowed small teams to fell trees that would have required armies of workers just decades earlier. As technology began to accelerate, so did the demand for timber. By 1890, the Pacific Northwest boom was in full swing, driven by massive demand from California's growing cities and the expanding railroad networks that needed lumber for construction. Like many men of the time looking for opportunity, Alfred Bruce Loop had carved out a homestead at the North Fork of the Nooksack River, a small clearing in an endless forest. But homesteading in the Pacific Northwest was a harsh gamble that broke most men. Most failed within 5 years. Starvation and disease killed people at rates that would shock modern sensibilities, and in some years, more homesteaders died than succeeded in establishing viable claims. Like many others, Loop and his family stood on the thin line between survival and ruin. One bad harvest or one injury, and he'd lose everything. But the Nooksack Giant, which stood on the edge of his property, represented a way out of poverty. He saw security for his family, a future free from starving in the wilderness. This single giant tree would yield 96,345 board feet of lumber, over $1,000 in income, which was more money than most families could earn in several years. The 480-year-old specimen that had survived the Little Ice Age, countless droughts, fires, and every other natural disaster the Pacific Northwest could throw at it, was about to be sacrificed for profit. In early 1896, a team of men arrived at Loop's homestead with their crosscut saws, and hours of exhausting work quickly destroyed something that had taken nearly 5 centuries to create. The massive sections were loaded onto rail cars and processed to be sold to the highest bidder. At the mill, the Nooksack Giant's lumber was immediately recognized as extraordinary. It was classified at the highest quality, with dense, slow-growth timber that only comes from ancient trees. Operators, amazed by its size, decided to display a massive cross-section. It was put on display in New Whatcom. A wooden placard documented the tree's vital statistics: 465 feet tall, 220 feet to the first limb, 33 feet 11 inches in circumference, and 480 years old. The display drew crowds. Visitors came from across the region to see the cross-section of what newspapers were calling the most magnificent tree ever felled. Yet the crowds weren't just marveling at the tree's size. Many were beginning to question whether something this ancient and irreplaceable should have been cut down at all. The New York Times captured this growing sentiment in its March 7, 1897 coverage, calling the tree's destruction, quote, "a truly pitiable tale and a crime," but the Nooksack Giant was just the beginning. Its destruction became a symbol of what was happening across the entire Pacific Northwest, where ancient forests were being systematically converted into lumber at an unprecedented scale. By 1919, companies were buying up vast tracts of ancient forest throughout western Washington and east of the Cascades, and their pattern of destruction was always the same. Timber cruisers identified the most valuable stands, railroad companies extended lines into inaccessible areas, and logging crews systematically harvested every commercially viable tree. The industry became so immense here that by the early 1890s, approximately 1/3 of Washington's entire population worked in the timber industry, creating entire communities existing solely to feed the demand for old-growth lumber. The state alone was producing 4.9 billion board feet of lumber annually, enough wood to build roughly 350,000 average-sized homes every single year. And things only got worse as the technology that doomed the Nooksack Giant spread rapidly. Steam-powered equipment almost completely replaced oxen and horses. Narrow-gauge logging railroads penetrated deeper into previously untouchable wilderness areas, and Caterpillar tractors could drag massive logs across terrain that would have been impossible to navigate just decades earlier. In 1949, more than 50 years after the Nooksack Giant fell, another ancient Douglas-fir was cut down. It was 145 years old and already deemed rare due to the quickly vanishing old-growth forests. But instead of being processed for lumber, it was transported 35 miles to downtown Bellingham to become what is still regarded as the tallest Christmas tree in history. 1,000 people gathered for its lighting ceremony. It stood decorated with hundreds of coloured lights and topped with a 15-foot star, its massive trunk rising above the streets of downtown Bellingham. Newspapers from Hawaii to South Africa covered the story, and children looked up at the remarkable tree and felt the magic of Christmas. But the cost of the celebration came at killing a specimen that had taken nearly a century and a half to grow, only so that we could decorate it for a single season. We had destroyed the very thing that made it worth celebrating, like stuffing a rare animal and displaying it in a museum. And while few voiced their objection at destroying these ancient trees, many simply didn't appreciate their importance. Influential foresters of the time, like Gifford Pinchot, even argued that old forests were wasteful, and that cutting them and replanting with fast-growing timber was the smart economic choice. From his perspective, ancient forests that grew slowly were inefficient uses of productive land. What he didn't appreciate is that you can't replicate 500 years of ecosystem complexity in a managed plantation. These forests were part of ecosystems that took centuries to develop. Trees, like the Nooksack Giant, are keystone species that create the conditions for entire ecosystems. Their roots, canopy structure, and decomposition patterns support thousands of other species in ways that managed timber plantations never could. But the economic incentives pointed in only one direction. Old-growth forests represented accumulated capital that could be harvested once for immediate profit. The fact that many trees were hundreds of years old meant the volume of wood in these forests increased very slowly, if at all. From a purely economic standpoint, cutting them down and replanting with fast-growing species made perfect sense. And the scale of this transformation becomes clear when you look at what we've lost. Researchers estimate that the Pacific Northwest originally contained roughly 19 million acres of old-growth forest. Today, less than 10% of that remains, and most of what survives is fragmented into small patches that can't support the complex ecosystems that once blanketed the region. And of course, the destruction of ancient woodland still continues today across the globe. Since 2015, an estimated 20% of all mature giant sequoias in the world have been lost. These trees, some over 3,000 years old, are falling not to cross-cut saws, but to wildfires and decades of fire suppression that allowed dangerous fuel loads to accumulate. While ancient forests in the Amazon, Borneo, and the Congo are being cleared at rates that make the Pacific Northwest timber boom look like child's play. Here, the same economic logic applies. Immediate profit from harvesting accumulated natural capital versus the uncertain value of preserving irreplaceable ecosystems. What we've learned too late is that these ancient forests aren't just important ecosystems, but they also represent living libraries of climate and ecological history that cannot be replicated. The Nooksack Giant's 480 rings contained information about climate patterns, fire cycles, and ecosystem changes that stretched back to the early 15th century. When the tree fell, that irreplaceable data was lost forever. Now, you might be wondering why we are talking about a single tree that was cut down over a century ago. And the reason for that is because the Nooksack Giant's story matters more today than ever before. These ancient trees represent living libraries of climate and ecological history that we're still learning to read. Every ring in the Nooksack Giant's trunk contained data about rainfall patterns, temperature fluctuations, fire cycles, and atmospheric conditions stretching back to 1416. When that tree was turned to timber, we lost centuries of climate data we can never recover. And the non-renewable nature of old-growth forests is something most people don't appreciate. You can replant a clear cut, but you cannot recreate an ancient forest. The complex soil microbiomes, intricate relationships between species, and massive carbon storage capacity all develop over centuries, not decades. What takes 500 years to grow cannot be replaced in any human lifetime. Modern conservation efforts are showing us both the urgency and the possibility of protection. The Giant Sequoia Lands Coalition has treated over 2,000 acres in the most at-risk groves, proving that active management can save these ancient giants. But they're racing against time. 20% of all mature giant sequoias have been lost since 2015 alone. The Nooksack Giant story serves as a cautionary tale for every environmental decision we face today. The same commerce-first thinking that justified cutting down that ancient tree is driving current threats to our remaining natural wonders. We're still making the same calculation that Alfred Bruce Loop faced in 1896: immediate economic benefit versus long-term ecological value. Whether it's old-growth forests being cleared for development or wetlands being drained for agriculture, we too often choose the immediate payoff. But here's what's different now. We have climate science that shows us that old-growth forests store massive amounts of carbon, helping regulate global climate. We know they support biodiversity that managed plantations never can. We know they provide ecosystem services, clean water, air purification, soil stabilization that are worth far more than their timber value. The permanent nature of these losses means every decision matters. Once an ancient forest is cut, it's gone forever. Future generations will inherit either the natural wonders we choose to protect today, or the stumps and stories of what we allowed to be destroyed. So support conservation organizations working to save ancient forests, vote for leaders who prioritize irreplaceable ecosystems over short-term profit, and share stories like this to help others understand what we're losing. That's how we avoid making the same mistakes that doomed the Nooksack Giant. Subscribe to hear more about the natural environment and what else is in this world that is worth saving.